Now I'd like to welcome John Dowd to the podium to give his presentation. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Peter. I too acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians. I see from the grey hairs in the audience that many of you, like me, remember the heady days after World War II when there were films about refugees and children in refugee camps and so on. It was an exciting time after the horrors of World War II, where in 1948, when that great international statesman, Dr. H.V. Evatt, he wasn't that much good as a politician, but as a statesman, was head of the United Nations when we adopted 68 years ago the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, an article of which led in 1951 to the Refugee Convention, which was then limited to time and space, and in 1967 was expanded by the first protocol to cover the world. Australia was one of those 26 nations then that were the first signatories of that Refugee Convention. And we were then, as one of the small nations of the United Nations, but head of the small nations, we did some exciting work and were involved in those great movements that led to the Genocide Convention and so on. Australia now has achieved a considerable diminution in its reputation. In fairness, it should be said we are one of the 3 nations that take people from the UNHCR, United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and for our size we're the best. The US takes about 55,000, Canada about 14,000, we take 13 and 750, leaving aside the 12,000, and that means Canada being twice our size and US being 16 times our size. We do very well in terms of UNHCR. And you've heard what Paul has said about the delay in getting through visa applications, and we haven't been able to do as well as Canada by a long chalk. But we've got to realise what has happened within the Australian people. Most people meeting refugees, most Australians get on well with them, make them welcome, and make them very much at home and adopt them like any other people. But the demonising that went on during the period of the boat people, deliberate naming and denigrating people by using the word illegals. They're not illegal. It is legal to enter a country where you're seeking asylum. Otherwise, as a matter of logic, you can't seek asylum, you've got to get in there. And the Convention clearly states that. We have, under the Convention, we call them illegals, and they're not. And I want to give you one thought which I haven't heard out there. We're now using the term economic migrants. Now, some of them are, of course. Some people have decided they want to move for a better place. But if I'm a father and my children are in a country like Syria, the Refugee Convention doesn't cover people avoiding bombs and war. It's not covered. It covers race, nationality and all of those, and we've developed laws about sex and anti-discrimination and so on. But if I'm a father of children and I want my children to live, I want to get them out of that country. I'm not an economic migrant. I may not have very many funds. I may not have anything. I'm entitled, like people have since the beginning of humankind, to try and do better for my family and to move. And people are moving, have been moving since, as I've said, the beginning of humankind. Now, Paul has talked about refugee camps and mentioned the African. I have been in many refugee camps in many parts of the world. Most of them are not camps with huts and some of them not even tents, just sheets of metal, just sheets of bark, just any sort of rubbish. In Kakuma camp in the west of Kenya, there you'll see just terrible, terrible conditions where children are brought up without floors, with dirt to sleep on at night, with no education. Now, of course, the human species does do education. It's why when I was a university chancellor, I was delighted to be part of education, because there are very few problems in the world that are not solved by education. But we are not doing enough about them. It's not easy to raise funds to help refugees. Now, the Australian government is spending money in Syria and in other parts of the world. And Australians, given a cause like the Syrian crisis, when we agreed to take the 12,000, a lot of Australians, yes, let's do that. We are by nature a generous people, but remembering to remain generous is tricky. It's very easy. I'm head of Action Aid Australia, which is a women's empowerment organisation throughout the world. And we know what it's like to put out a call for money. Vanuatu, we put out a call, we got money. We went over there and helped them to rehabilitate and redevelop. We raised funds, but people don't remember. Other things happen in this media age, so on. People forget some other crisis occurs, another important thing like a sporting game comes up. So remember, some people are economic refugees, but they're not illegal, and they are there as of right. And both sides of politics have been guilty of that. But what is our duty as Australians and as Australia to refugees? If you were drawing the Refugee Convention today, there are a lot of improvements you would make. That is, people like us would make. But there's no point in trying to change the Refugee Convention, because it would be diluted and cut down. We're stuck with it as it is, and there's no way we can change it to make it easy, because all you do is make it harder for refugees. Europe, most of the nations of Europe were part of that original 26 nations that dealt with refugees. But Europe is now facing the harsh realities of, I think, stupid Angela Merkel talking about, we can take this number, and not realising that not every nation was going to be prepared to share in that. Governments tend to be more selfish than people, but people don't always remain open-hearted, and so that Europe now, and Europe of course has got worse problems in terms of boat people, because coming from Africa, there are no way you can hold people. There's no way you can stop the whole of the Mediterranean, and we are going to see again and again and again people trying to get into Europe. But what about us Australians? The Refugee Convention, of which we were a proud signatory, is being breached. Turning people back is good politics. There's no doubt that it's good politics in terms of votes to say we turn back the boats. And I suspect if there were a change of government, that policy wouldn't change. Because it was Kevin Rudd who said no one that comes to Australia by boat will be settled here, so that both sides of politics are equally guilty. And it's all very well for the Greens to be holier than thou and say, we would do this. They supported the Gillard and Rudd governments that in fact caused the massive 30,000 people who are still here, who still haven't been processed and came during that time. So there's no saints up there in Canberra dealing with what's happened. We have to, as a nation, accept that whether it's inconvenient or not, we have to lift our game to bring people in to Australia. The ones that are sent to Manus and Nauru, they are our responsibility. They are claiming to come to Australia. You can't send them off to inadequate accommodation, and although they're building hospitals and it's getting better and all those things we hear, you can't send them off there and wipe your hands, do a Pontius Pilate. You've got to accept that they sought to come to Australia under our international treaty. They are part of Australia's obligation, and we can't divest ourselves by handing them off to another country which has inadequate resources, inadequate people to train, to process these, and inadequate medical circumstances. We don't have a big debate about this. I mean, a body like politics in the pub, yes, we do. But out there, people aren't. And the number of people that attacked me because I said we should keep the 267, what do they say? They say, oh, you're going to open the floodgates. There is no doubt that if it is made easier for people to come here, the people smugglers who operate without character or merit will in fact exploit any gaps. And governments have to work hard not to encourage that awful business. But that's not the only issue. The issue is Australia is a party to an international treaty that gives them a legal right to come here. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, all the treaties we're party to. We're happy to be party to and acknowledge. but we're not prepared to do the hard yards to implement them. I know people, as some of you will do, that have lived in camps. People from East Timor who went across to Kupang and eventually found their way around the world to here. I have, at one stage when we were trying to do something about the East Timorese, I was even barred by a sign out at Villawood that I personally wasn't allowed to go there to interview people. And even though I had permission from the then Minister, Philip Ruddock, the head of hostels rang me and said, please don't, we don't want trouble in the camps. There will always be a reason given, and the deaths at sea are appalling. But that's only part of the excuse. We are not entitled, having come here, where there are very few people here tonight of Aboriginal origin, there may be some, but at some point in time, we decided to come to Australia, or our ancestors did, or whatever. We sought refuge for various reasons, perhaps economic. But having done so, it doesn't entitle us to stand back. And sure, as my late mother said once to me, you can't solve all the problems. I said, the answer is, I can solve what I can. I can solve what I can. We Australians have a proud reputation which has been tarnished. People even say, oh, well, the Australian solution, that's the way to go in Europe. There are people applauding us for our appalling standard. So what I ask you to do is this. Don't allow people to talk about economic refugees without challenging them. Don't, every time people say we've got a refugee convention or the rights of the child, don't say, oh, we don't want to encourage the boat people again. Of course we don't lightly want people to come to sea. But you've got to remember, Australia is operating illegally, not just by not accepting people, but by turning them back. One of the principal bases of the Refugee Convention and one of the principles of international law is non-refoulement. Non-refoulement means don't return. Now, if we send people back, sending people back to not to the country they came from is not non-refoulement. Sending them back to, like Sri Lanka, sending them back to Sri Lanka is an illegal act in international law, because most of them that come will be subject to criminal proceedings, if not worse, in Sri Lanka. We are not entitled to do it, and yet hardly anybody queries that. You've got to know how people are processed, and the process you can't do at sea. You've got to allow people to land and process them. And Paul and I have seen the most appalling techniques for interviewing people, the questions that they're asked and so on, under our present law, so that people who are genuine refugees, not only the ones, the figures that Paul, you've heard from Paul, but a lot of other people are being sent back to a place like Sri Lanka, and some of them have their life at risk for that. I would like to see Australia, inconvenient though it is in this lucky country to take in additional refugees, I'd like to see us take as many as we can, because there's, 60 million of them in internal displacement and so on. I sit as chair of a tribunal, the Mental Health Review Tribunal, and I have seen cases come before me of people who've been damaged by being in refugee camps and in war situations. Those human beings are entitled, like all of us, to live their life. I am entitled to give my children the best opportunities they can, and grandchildren and so on. So remember, unless you, the people that think, remind people how good we were, we won't become great again. I'm sounding like Donald Trump. And the United States was one of those 26 countries too that signed the Refugee Convention. We want Australia to be looked up to, not talked about in the world as the Australian solution. I want us to make people welcome here. We've all done fairly well as we can. We want them to. Let's hurry the government along, and if there's a change of government, help that government along to make sure that we take everyone we said we would, and then work out other solutions to the refugee boat owners, the trade there. There are ways of getting around it. Just be a little more clever about it. Just don't treat people like animals.